is for girls in conflict and disaster. I've seen firsthand how gender responsive and quality education can definitely change lives and shape community, but mostly advanced nations. Today, January 20, in 4 days, is the International Day of Education. I believe that it's necessary today more than ever that we reflect on how the pandemic has increased gender-related barriers to equality and safe education, such as gender-based violence that has increased, child and forced marriage that has also increased, lack of access to healthcare that has increased, menstrual hygiene products that become more restricted for many young girls in conflict areas to access them, unpaid domestic labor that has increased, and more importantly, that we also reflect on how in fragile context, this pandemic has thrown away our education systems as we knew it. So in this gathering today and the conversation that we're about to have, it's rooted on the report produced by EcoMeasure in partnership with GAC, FAO, IPBF, and Plan Canada. At EcoMeasure, they believe that data can help shine a spotlight on these issues, but also make advocacy and advocate much more powerful. So today, we have incredible feminists, advocates, experts from all around the world on education in emergencies for girls, and also mainly on gender data. So before we start, I just wanted to make sure that you all know we have interpretation for English and French. So please make sure you follow instructions on the screen and in the chat to ensure that you are in the correct channel. Our first speaker is Justice Sass. Justice Sass is the Chief Section of Education for Inclusion and Gender Equality at UNESCO. Over the past 25 years, she has championed gender equality, girls and women's empowerment, and the right to education and health. Justice, over to you.
Thank you very much, Judy-Kael. It's very nice to be with all of you here today and to welcome you to this global report launch, leveraging data and partnerships with women's rights organizations to strengthen girls' education in emergencies. I would like to first warmly thank our partners and co-hosts, Equal Measures 2030, FAO, IPBF, the Geneva Global Hub for Education and Emergencies, Global Affairs Canada, and Plan International Canada for inviting UNESCO to be part of this initiative, which we are highly committed to and fully support. The Education 2030 Framework for Action specifically stresses the need for education systems that are more resilient and responsive in the face of conflict, social unrest and natural hazards, and to ensure that education is maintained during emergency, conflict, and post-conflict situations. This is needed now more than ever before. As Judy-Kael has shared in the introduction, education and many other aspects of our lives have been profoundly disrupted by COVID-19 pandemic, which at its peak put over 1.6 billion learners out of school across 190 countries. Protracted crises and disasters are also occurring and creating a double crisis in many contexts and leading to the temporary or permanent abandonment of education among the most marginalized, often girls. While education is key for the advancement of individuals and also societies, it can also be a lifeline in emergency contexts. It can offer a protective and stable environment that supports the physical, social, emotional, and well-being of learners, and also the reconstruction of the social, economic, and political entire fabrics of societies. But as it was outlined in the 2019 EIE Data Summit, one of the key challenges facing education in crisis-affected contexts is the lack of accurate, timely, reliable data to inform good action. Data are often fragmented, insufficiently disaggregated by sex, by age, or other parameters, or collected with the participation of local actors, including women's rights organizations, who are the frontline responders in so many contexts. In addition, learners, teachers, and other grassroots organizations often are not sufficiently engaged, which means that we don't actually fully understand the gendered barriers to education, and we can't develop effective responses. During the event today, we're going to have the opportunity to dive into the findings of the report developed by EM 2030 and partners to better understand what these barriers are and the highly valuable role of women's rights organizations in data production and use in emergencies. A few words about UNESCO, just in our support for this partnership. As the UN lead for SDG 4 coordination and part of our commitment to the 2030 agenda, we're really pleased to be part of this initiative today, calling for better data and partnership with women's rights organizations to ensure that responses are data-driven, gender responsive, and resilient. The work that is being presented today is also fully aligned with UNESCO's global priority for gender equality and our support to ministries of education to strengthen data systems in emergencies and crises. We stand with you and by you. I look forward to today's fruitful discussions and to further commitments to ensure that all girls can fulfill their right to education, because as we say at UNESCO, her education is not only for her, it's for our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. Next, we are going to watch a video that speaks about impact stories created from Equals to 30 in partnership with their partners in Burkina Faso and Kenya. But as we watch this video, I want to all of us to remember what Justin said, that data is important because it inspires actions. The more we are aware of what's happening on the ground, the more we are aware of how much work needs to be done to address all these realities.
Leveraging data and partnerships strengthening girls' education in emergencies with women's rights organizations. Key facts. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 30% of primary school-age girls are out of school, compared to 17% of boys. Refugees and IDPs are rarely factored into national policies, severely limiting their access to quality education in emergencies. Burkina Faso and Kenya do not report sufficient data to receive a score in the SDG Gender Index on the indicator on NEET, not in employment, education, or training. This means that advocates and policymakers are missing key information about adolescent girls and young women. In addition, the outcomes of the most marginalized groups are often not captured in national averages, making them invisible in public policy. Key findings. Any solution to girls' education in emergencies in sub-Saharan Africa must start with those who have a strong understanding of the challenges facing them. In this case, women's rights organizations in Burkina Faso and Kenya. Key gender barriers to education access: gender-based violence, discrimination, child and forced marriage, and lack of access to healthcare and menstrual hygiene management and other basic services. Plus, unpaid care work and domestic labor, school fees, prioritization of boys' education over girls. Even those with access face issues such as poor quality facilities, large class sizes, lack of qualified teachers, and lack of gender parity among teaching staff. Key recommendations. Incorporate women's rights organizations more through decentralization and at every stage. Address the diversity of challenges through partnerships, which can provide a more intersectional and cross-sectoral approach. Data is useful and important, but there are issues with access, reliability, and amplification of results. Organizations should receive clear instructions on how to access government databases and how to use them. Large institutions imposing fund structures have limited understanding of local contexts. They are imposing colonial power dynamics and forcing grassroots organizations to compromise programs for basic resources. Funders should listen, decolonize funding practices, and apply participatory approaches to program design and distribution of resources.
Thank you so much for this great video. I think one of the things that I just took from the presentation is decolonize funding practices. And I think it's important as we go through this conversation that we keep thinking about what that will mean as people part of international organization. What does it mean to decolonize and how that looks like for girls that are living in emergencies or in situations of crisis. Now we are going to open remarks. We're going to start with Kathleen Flynn Dapa. She's the Director of Education, Gender-Based Violence and Child Protection for Global Affairs Canada. She has worked for more than 10 years on issues related to children's rights, including 3 years with the Government of Canada, working on First Nation education reform. Prior to joining the government, Kathleen worked for 10 years at the International Development Research Center. More about Canada in this project, the Government of Canada has shown leadership on feminist funding and support for the education for girls in emergency through their Child Devoir Declaration. Can we have Kathleen give her opening remarks? And maybe she can tell us more about how Canada is decolonizing funding practices.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to everyone from unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence around this area of Canada reaches back to time immemorial. In moments like this, we'd like to honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We need to acknowledge the role that we all need to play in reconciliation and challenge everyone to take meaningful and concrete action. I'm thrilled to be here today amongst such a wonderful panel and as a part of celebrations for International Day of Education and to support the global launch of Leveraging Data and Partnerships with Women's Rights Organizations to Strengthen Girls' Education in Emergencies report. Canada has indeed been a longstanding advocate for access to safe and inclusive quality education for all, including girls and adolescent girls. Cet engagement se traduit dans notre politique d'aide internationale féministe, qui non seulement reconnaît le rôle central que l'éducation des filles et des adolescentes joue dans l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable, mais aussi qui considère les filles comme de puissantes agentes de changement qui doivent être incluses en tant que participantes à part intérieure aux décisions qui affectent leur vie. It is data and the evidence it provides that infuses our policy decisions and allows us to make informed choices about where support is needed. Evidence shows that when girls are given early access to education and are supported throughout their studies, they are more likely to graduate and therefore improve their future earning potential and benefit themselves, their families, and their communities. Evidence also shows us, though, that the world's poorest girls are the least able to access education and therefore less likely to break the cycle of poverty. Girls are also less likely than boys to enroll in school and complete their education, and this is due to a variety of barriers, as we just saw in the video. Societal expectations that they should stay home to complete domestic chores, child early and forced marriage, early pregnancy and motherhood, sexual and gender-based violence in and around schools, and inadequate infrastructure, especially wash facilities. These barriers we know worsen when intersecting with other marginalizing factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability, and displacement. As an example, while refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children, refugee girls are 2.5 times more likely to drop out of school than their male counterparts. Girls and adolescent girls, especially those on the move, also face social barriers in accessing education, as they are more likely than boys to become victims of sexual and gender-based violence and other harmful practices. Since its onset, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how fragile the progress towards SDGs can be, and how marginalized populations can become even more vulnerable to stresses in times of crisis. So it is no surprise that evidence from past crises, such as the Ebola crisis, shows us how girls can be vulnerable in the impacts of these pandemics and crises. They're at a higher risk of not going back to school when they reopen, and closures can lead to an increase in child early and forced marriage, transactional sex to cover basic needs, and teenage pregnancies. I think many of us have seen the stats from UNICEF that show that the impacts of the global pandemic could lead to 10 million additional cases of child early and forced marriage in the next decade, or the statistics from Malala Fund estimating that 20 million girls will not return to school because of the pandemic. Nous savons que pour assurer une programmation efficace et pertinente, il est crucial d'avoir accès à des données de qualité. Lorsque les décisions sont éclairées par les connaissances des femmes et des filles qui comprennent leurs véritables obstacles et défis auxquels elles sont confrontées, on s'assure non seulement de proposer des solutions plus adaptées et efficaces, mais on place les femmes et les filles comme des agents actifs. The disproportionate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic have highlighted the critical role that women's rights organizations play in addressing the needs and priorities of women and girls in crisis situations. They're the most effective advocates for women's and girls' rights and have established networks to advance gender-responsive approaches and provide basic services. At Global Affairs Canada, we were impressed by the agility and flexibility shown by our partners on the ground. These very women's rights organizations who pivoted to address the new and emerging needs of women and girls in their communities with the onset of COVID. Canada is really pleased to be working with Equal Measures 2030 to support women's rights organizations in effectively using data to advocate for girls' right to education and to make their voices heard in decision-making processes. By supporting women's rights organizations in accessing, analyzing, and communicating data for advocacy, the project aims to improve data-driven and gender-responsive education systems in regions of Kenya and Burkina Faso. Through the 2018 Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education, Canada led the G7 to make education a priority along the development and humanitarian spectrum, including the development and humanitarian nexus. Acknowledging that in order to achieve sustainable development, we need to address access to quality education for forcibly displaced, conflict and crisis-affected girls and women. Over the last 3 years, we have been rolling out the Charlevoix Education Commitment and its associated programming. We've learned a lot, as have our partners. Building on the Charlevoix initiative, in February 2021, Canada launched an international campaign called Together for Learning, which promotes quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for refugees, other forcibly displaced, and host community children and youth. The campaign has 4 areas of focus: programming excellence, diplomatic engagement, amplifying local voices, and building the evidence base. And as a part of the campaign's 4th pillar, building the evidence base, Canada works with Canadian and international partners to address the gaps in evidence on education for refugee, internally displaced, and host community children and youth. Building the evidence base is key to get to a strengthened and robust data and evidence ecosystem to reach well-informed decisions and to ensure the collective impact for the education of refugees and IDP children and youth. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is that women's rights organizations, refugee-led organizations, and other grassroots organizations are a part of that collective effort to improve evidence and data. I want to thank Equal Measures 2030, UNESCO, Geneva Global Hub for Education and Emergencies, Forum for African Educationalists, FAWE, l'Initiative Guthrie pour le bien-être de la femme, IBBF, and Plan International for organizing this event today, for inviting me to speak, and for the critical work that they continue to advance. I am really looking forward to hearing some of the practical applications and more on the recommendations that came from the report so that we can understand the power of data and discuss its central role in addressing barriers for girls' education in emergencies. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And yes, I can agree with you that the pandemic has shown us how fragile SDGs can be, but also how quickly some can lose their rights, like the number of millions of girls that won't return to school after the pandemic and how tragic that is. Next, we are going to get into the report. Our first speaker is Nadia. Nadia is a program manager at Girls Education in Emergencies in Sub-Saharan Africa at Measures 2030. Nadia is a global development professional specializing in the application of gender analysis in philanthropy, advocacy, and policy work. She has over 13 years experience supporting women's rights organizations in numerous countries and across all the region. From all the conversation we've had since we started, we clearly see the value of leveraging data to protect and ensure safe, accessible, and quality learning for girls. And through this project, I know that Measure 2030 has been working to better understand the data landscape, but mostly to map opportunities and challenges for girls' education in fragile regions of Kenya and Burkina Faso, as detailed in the report. Nadia, could you share with us highlights from the report, but mostly around leveraging data, partnership with women's rights organizations to strengthen girls' education in emergencies?
Thank you, Judy-Kael, and thank you to everybody who is joining us today to hear about this important work that we have been doing with FAWE and IPBF in Kenya and Burkina Faso with the support of the government of Canada. As many of the speakers before and Judy-Kael have mentioned, education is really a ladder out of poverty and a way to break cycles of abuse and violence, but gender-related barriers really hamper girls' and women's access to quality education. And I think that when you are faced with refugee crises, when you are faced with communities affected by terrorism, then those challenges get even steeper. We're thinking beyond class sizes and beyond qualified female teachers, but really looking at threats that can include kidnapping, injury, forced recruitment, and even displacement. As Judy-Kael has rightfully raised, the COVID-19 pandemic has just made everything worse. And so these are some of the things that our research has shown, but mostly it's shown that even though the contexts in Kenya and Burkina Faso are very, very different, the threats remain the same, and girls in both countries are actually at imminent risk of disruptions to their education. And this has an impact on their lifelong cycle of learning. Some of the things that really jumped out at us as we were doing this work and just looking at the research is that, number one, women's rights organizations are absent from national discussions on challenges and directions for policy and intervention around education in emergencies. I think you'll all agree with me that without any representations from grassroots communities, there's a certain nuance that is lost and creating condition for gaps in service delivery. We all know that the story of girls and other marginalized groups, including people with disabilities, as a participant rightfully mentioned in the chat, means that they get lost in national statistics and national averages, and the kind of nuance that women's rights organizations begins to shine a light on these individuals. The other thing that we found and that we detail in the report is that there are many programs that are implemented by women's rights organizations, by international NGOs, and even governments that are achieving promising results in Kenya and in Burkina Faso and in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The challenge is that they are really localized in their impact and they only target specific aspects of the EIE landscape. So when you move up to national decision-making spaces, again, that is lost. I think the other thing that women's rights organizations that we engaged with during the project acknowledged was that data collection from the grassroots and then access to national databases is critical in developing services, but also enabling the women's rights organizations to conduct effective advocacy. As one of the participants rightfully noted in the chat, is that sometimes there's difficulty in accessing national databases, right? So why does this gap exist? And what are some of the challenges that organizations and individuals individuals face in accessing these databases, in inputting into them, and in making sure that this critical nuance from grassroots is part of decision making. I think a big challenge that was raised by some of the participants that we engaged with throughout this 2-year project was that women's rights organizations sometimes don't have the capacity to access the data, but also to engage in data sharing and ensure the reliability of the data that they share. And so sometimes the amplification of their data analysis is not sufficient for their advocacy. The other thing that was raised, especially by Judicael when she was talking about decolonization, is that, let's face it, funding structures for women's rights organizations are largely imposed by global institutions who have very limited understanding of local context. So you find in the EIE space that there's a replication of colonial inequalities, and this really places grassroots organizations in a position where they sometimes have to compromise their mission just to access basic resources, again, taking away from the problems that that specific context requires to be solved. I think as EM 2030, when we're thinking about the SDG goal of equal education for all, we are beginning to see and to learn different lessons from the experience of girls who live in crisis situations and women's rights organizations who can amplify their stories. What we find is that our report and the research that fed into it really begins to provide grounded data and recommendations for stronger mechanisms of collaboration between women's rights organizations, governments, and INGOs and other agencies involved in this complex sector. The other thing the report does, which is very useful to other women's rights organizations working on girls' education, is that it provides some grounding in terms of the landscape for women's rights organizations to use quality data to advocate for girls' rights and to make sure that their voices are heard in decision-making processes. We also spoke to a few policymakers from both countries in this context, and to be sure, policymakers do acknowledge that there are shortcomings in terms of policy making that affect girls in fragile environments, and recognize the potential that women's rights organizations have to fill these gaps. I think for us at Equal Measures is to really reinforce the point that when women and girls who really understand the specific barriers and challenges that they face are involved in the decisions that concern them, we're really going to see a shift in the tailored and effective solutions relating to girls' education, but also we're really going to see a shift in power in the EIE ecosystem. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we are seeking to promote through this report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I'll pick up on your last sentence, shift the power. And I think one of the ways this pandemic has shown us that power needs to be shifted is to believe that communities actually know what they need and they know how to address the realities affecting them. There are two things that I took from your presentation that I want to emphasize for everybody who's listening. The first thing is women rights organizations are absent from national conversation. And that's frequent. We have seen it regardless of the context. Then there is the gap between the data collection from grassroots organization and the national database, and how much grassroots organizations don't even believe that their data is good enough to be in national database. So I think that's a conversation that we can keep having among ourselves. But I also liked how you mentioned that even though contexts are different, threats remains the same across Burkina Faso, across Kenya. Next, our speaker is going to be Teresa Otieno. Teresa Otieno is the CEO of FAWE Kenya, with whom EcoMeasure had the great pleasure to partner for this report. She has more than 11 years of experience leading, coordinating, operationalizing strategies into action, and managing donor-funded development programs, especially in education and health in Kenya. Through this project, FAWE Kenya has pieced together data from government reports and local media reports showing that school closure have exposed girls to early unwanted pregnancies, child marriage, child labor, domestic violence, child abuse, and other forms of child exploitation. Teresa, could you please share with us about your learnings throughout this project, especially looking at how data has showed showed up in relationship to your work with women and girls, and how it intersects with their vulnerabilities. You can also maybe share your recommendation for stakeholders seeking to address the barriers that girls in emergencies are facing in Kenya.
Thank you so much. Fawe Kenya has been implementing Equal Measure project since last year, and we have been interacting a lot with women rights organizations and training them on the use of data to influence their decision making. And in regards to data, we have been able to see data really being used strongly when it comes to policy, advocacy, and ensuring that every stakeholder is involved in terms of ensuring that they participate in integrating the data and influencing the policy issues at the national level and also at the county level. Through the training that we have had with women rights organizations within the country, especially in the county of Turkana and also the county of Nairobi, that is Eastleigh area, we have realized that we can see data in the area of strengthening the multisectoral responses that are really key in terms of ensuring that we address the barriers to girls' education. When we have the data, then we realize that every stakeholder is really willing to be able to associate with those specific data, but also ensuring that they want really to be part of the team in terms of enhancing advocacy at the community level and also at the national level. Through our work within Kenya, we have been able also to see data in strengthening the coordination of education and integrating gender issues into the stakeholder engagement, because when we have data and when we have an evidence on barriers to girls' education and how really they can be able to be addressed, then we realize that the coordination in terms of involving even other stakeholders and women rights organizations become much stronger because they have a base where they can make reference to. And even this has really helped, because when it comes to even policy engagement at the national level and the county level, including the county government, we realize that it strengthens coordination, and also it really brings out strongly the ways in which key issues can be integrated into the national policies and even county policies. Through our work, and especially by use of the research pieces that we have been able to have through support from Equal Measure and GAG, we have also been able to actually use the data in terms of creating awareness within the community, and also creating more partnership to influence community to use to prioritize girls' issues in terms of just ensuring that they are able to showcase them as a priority that needs to be considered within the county. As a country, we have county government that now has the mandate of putting some allocation for addressing the barriers to girls' education. That is the challenges that girls face within the community. And so by having the data, it gives really us and even the women rights organization the strength to be able to showcase what is happening, and even to enable the county government to be able to have it as a priority. Through our work and use of data, we have also been able to really convince the politicians, especially the ones based at the county level, to be able to showcase, to be able to integrate the girls' education and barriers to girls' education into their manifestos. As we know, this year we'll be having elections in August. It will be having elections in August this year. And so by use of the existing data that we have, the research pieces that we have, we've really been able to ensure that the female politicians integrate issues that are affecting our girls into their manifesto, and making them really to be able to consider it as a priority in terms of ensuring that our girls are retained in school and are able to realize their education potential. Throughout our work in Kenya, we have been able to have recommendations to stakeholders seeking to address barriers to girls' education. And one of the recommendations that we really saw that is very, very strong is to promote multisectoral approach and combining education and child protection and gender, and also ensuring that we bring in the component of health. When we were starting this program, our focus more was on education, but when we continue to implement it, and also based on the research pieces that we were able to gather, we realized that it's really important as a country to bring other stakeholders on board, not only education stakeholders, but also child protection department, gender department, Ministry of Health department, and also a component of State Department of Gender, so that when we are addressing issues that are affecting our girls, then we address them holistically, including child marriage, including teenage pregnancy, and poverty that is also contributing to girls dropping out of school. The second recommendation that we realize that is very strong in terms of ensuring that we really address barriers to girls' education is investing more in improving teaching and learning materials. With this, we realized through our research pieces, we were able to realize that the teachers within these institutions, especially in Turkana, first, there are really few female teachers, and this is really a hindrance to girls' education because they lack mentors. And secondly, there are few learning resources, especially for the host community. And if this could be picked up, then we'll be able to realize a situation where we have more female teachers within the institutions of learning, that is primary and secondary, and also learning materials. But apart from that, there'll be also continuation in terms of mentorship and being able really to ensure that these teachers have also been trained in a way that they teach in a qualified way. We have also been able to see a key component that really for us as a recommendation is a way of promoting community-based and data-driven approaches, whereby we have really to ensure that we engage the community in data collection. And one of the things that we need really to ask ourselves is reflecting on ways of collecting data. How really are we collecting data? And then ways of the designing of programs. We really need to look at that very strongly, because by incorporating the grassroots women rights organization and even the girls within the community, they can be able to really come up with issues that can contribute towards us addressing the key problems that they are facing within the community, and like just us or stakeholders just coming up with the things that they feel that might be facing the girls within the community. So by really involving the grassroots women rights organization and the girls themselves who experience this problem, then in a bigger way, we'll be able to address the problems that are affecting our girls within the communities that they are coming from. There's also a key component where we are saying that there's need to create partnership and collaboration with key stakeholders. Key stakeholders include the girls themselves, the parents of these girls, the community, the school, and even the community, so that we are able to know which are some of the areas that are really contributing to girls dropping out of school, and what are some of the factors that can contribute to them being retained in school. And so when we make it in a way that it creates more partnership, and everyone feel part of the problem, then everyone within the community and even within the school environment will be able to participate in terms of just ensuring that they keep the girls in school. There'll be that component of parents willing to guide their girls and providing guidance and ensuring that they are part of the growth of the girl. But again, at school level, teachers will be mentoring the girls. So issues that are affecting the girls will be addressed from all corners, and this will contribute to them being retained in school. There's also need for community mobilization and sensitization, so that even the cultural issues that are affecting our girls, like the beading of girls, whereby girls are getting married as at the age of even 8 or even 7 within the Turkana County. These will be faded off when we have a really stronger sensitization of community and even involvement of local leaders for them to be able to play a key role in terms of transforming the community. And we believe that with this, we'll be able to specifically address the child marriage issue that is really common in the host community in Turkana. And when we do this, then we'll have saved our girls from poverty, from hard life, and we'll have given them an opportunity to realize their education potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I took a couple of notes, but there are something that keeps coming up since we started. It's a point of involving grassroots organizations and girls when we are addressing inequalities that are affecting them. So I believe that's the only way we can truly shift the power. by believing that actually women and girls know exactly what they need and how to address all these inequalities that are affecting them. On va partir sur notre prochaine panéliste, Micheline Wendiam Caboret. Wendiam est une militante des droits humains féministe engagée qui s'investit dans un monde égalitaire qui respecte les droits des filles et des femmes. Elle est sensible aux inégalités de genre et captivée par les études en genre et développement. Elle croit fermement que le développement et le bien-être des filles et des femmes dépendent nécessairement de leur autonomisation, de leur résilience et de leur leadership engagé. Depuis janvier 2020, elle consacre cette énergie à diriger les travaux de l'initiative Pananetugri pour le bien-être des femmes, IBPF, une ONG burkinabé engagée dans la promotion des droits des filles et des femmes. Le Burkina Faso semble être confronté à des défis similaires à ceux du Kenya, avec le fardeau supplémentaire des écoles qui restent fermées pour des raisons de sécurité. Des enseignants ont été menacés, voire assassinés, des filles qui sont kidnappées et violées. Et si vous êtes actif sur les réseaux, vous êtes au courant de ce qui se passe. Wendiam, est-ce que tu peux partager davantage sur l'approche communautaire de votre organisation et les enseignements du Burkina Faso grâce à ce partenariat avec Éco-Mesures 2020 de 2030 et également sur la manière dont les données apparaissent dans son travail en ce qui concerne les femmes et les filles et leur vulnérabilité croisée? Tu peux aussi nous partager également les recommandations pour les parties prenantes qui cherchent à surmonter les obstacles pour les filles au Burkina Faso. Merci. Micheline?
Le micro.
While we wait for Micheline, I just wanted to flag that we are having a few technical issues and apologize for the quality of the presentations. Our team is working on it. Micheline, tu es ici?
Sauf que je n'entendais pas, je suis restée pendant 5 minutes sans entendre ce qui se disait. Je n'avais pas de son, j'ai signalé dans la ligne de discussion. Donc, je suis là. Je ne sais pas si on m'entend, si on me voit. Vous m'entendez? Allô?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oui, je vous entends parfaitement. Je n'ai pas eu de message, donc je ne sais pas. Est-ce que je dois parler maintenant? Je n'ai aucune idée de ce qui a été dit avant. Je n'avais pas de son, je n'ai rien entendu.
Can you ask Micheline if she heard my question?
Non.
Micheline, est-ce que tu peux commencer ta présentation? On t'écoute.
C'est possible de reprendre pour que je puisse intervenir parce que je n'entendais rien du tout. J'ai signalé, mais il n'y avait pas de son.
On a juste lancé pour que tu puisses commencer ta présentation.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Allô? Allô? Merci beaucoup. Parce que comme je n'ai pas saisi la question, c'est ce que j'étais en train d'expliquer. Je n'ai pas entendu ce qui a été dit auparavant. Donc, du coup, si je dois intervenir ou pas, je n'ai aucune idée. Mais je commence.
I'm happy to repeat. I am happy to repeat.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je remercie beaucoup Teresa qui a parlé avant moi, qui a présenté la situation au niveau du Kenya et au niveau du Burkina Faso. L'initiative Pananetugri pour le bien-être de la femme, IPBF, est partenaire au projet et nous avons également, à travers ce projet, pu travailler sur la situation de l'éducation des filles au niveau du Burkina en situation d'urgence. À ce niveau, et selon les données que nous avons de l'indice de genre des ODD 2019, le Burkina Faso enregistre un score insuffisant en matière d'égalité des genres. Depuis 2015, nous sommes confrontés à une grave crise de conflits armés entraînant un impact négatif sur les taux de scolarisation et de maintien des élèves dans les écoles, et notamment pour les jeunes filles qui sont en grand nombre. De nombreuses écoles sont fermées dans les zones de conflit avec un déplacement massif des populations vers la capitale et vers d'autres grandes régions. Et ces conséquences se ressentent particulièrement au niveau des filles. Elles vivent dans des camps de déplacés qui sont 2 fois moins susceptibles de trouver des établissements d'enseignement, surtout secondaires, que leurs homologues masculins. Les obstacles spécifiques auxquels nous sommes confrontés concernant les données, c'est que les services étatiques, le ministère de l'Éducation et d'autres grandes organisations collectent les données, mais ce ne sont pas des données désagrégées. Elles ne font pas d'objet d'études rigoureuses et il existe peu de preuves empiriques permettant d'identifier avec clairvoyance ce qui fonctionne pour lutter contre les inégalités de genre dans l'éducation. Il y a également les facteurs qui déterminent l'impact sur les différents contextes politiques, sociaux, culturels et du genre. C'est ainsi que les organisations de défense des droits des filles et des femmes se sont engagées pour une meilleure utilisation des données dans leurs actions de plaidoyer en faveur de l'éducation des filles dans les zones en situation d'urgence au niveau du Burkina Faso, en collaboration avec Equal Measure. La culture de la collecte des données, notamment les données probantes et exactes dans les activités mises en œuvre par les organisations de défense des droits des femmes et des filles au Burkina, ne constitue pas une activité empirique reconnue. La plupart des données sont collectées par les services techniques, les directions étatiques décentralisées, certaines institutions spécifiques de l'État, dont le rôle est la production de données statistiques, mais également par certaines institutions et organisations internationales. Donc, les organisations nationales, quant à elles, peinent vraiment à constituer des bases de données crédibles qui assurent une collecte régulière des données sur le terrain. La plupart des causes défendues ne sont malheureusement pas soutenues par des données tangibles et évidentes, capables de confirmer les différentes hypothèses et surtout à faire ressortir, relever et insister sur les évidences dont nous voulons évoquer. C'est ainsi que le projet de plaidoyer guidé par les données en situation d'urgence relève tout un sens pour nous. À travers les activités, une vingtaine d'organisations de défense des droits des filles et des femmes du Burkina qui travaillent en faveur de l'éducation des filles ont pu bénéficier d'un processus de renforcement des capacités dans le domaine du plaidoyer guidé par les données. Elles ont pu acquérir de l'expérience en collecte, analyse et exploitation de données et elles ont pu également, à travers des exercices pratiques, utiliser ces données pour le plaidoyer à travers l'élaboration de messages de plaidoyer, d'argumentaires de plaidoyer et également la réalisation d'actions de plaidoyer au niveau local. Ces actions visaient vraiment pour objectif de faire prendre conscience aux autorités locales dans les zones affectées par la crise sécuritaire sur la situation de l'éducation des filles avec des données, des chiffres à l'appui qui ont été collectés par les organisations de défense des droits des filles et des femmes. Aussi, il y a eu un problème de désagrégation des données selon le genre, et les acteurs historiques de collecte s'en tiennent souvent aux données standards sans pour autant tenir compte de l'intersectionnalité à travers le prisme du genre. Quand elles sont désagrégées, il manque aussi des analyses sur la vulnérabilité croisée des femmes et des filles, ce qui ne permet pas le développement et la formulation de mesures adéquates qui prennent en compte leurs diverses vulnérabilités. À travers les études communautaires que nous avons réalisées dans le cadre de ce projet, nous avons pu apercevoir l'importance d'avoir une lecture croisée des cibles ainsi que des différents indicateurs de collecte. Sur la situation du taux d'achèvement et d'accès scolaire des filles déplacées internes dans la boucle du monde, il ressort des données de l'étude qu'en plus de la faible capacité d'accueil des infrastructures scolaires, il y a des questions d'hébergement, d'alimentation, de santé, les fournitures scolaires qui ne sont pas disponibles mais surtout la recrudescence de certaines violences basées sur le genre. Il faut dire qu'à travers cette crise, les filles sont davantage victimes de mariages précoces, de travail d'enfants, parce qu'elles se retrouvent dans des familles pour servir de filles de ménage au lieu d'être à l'école. Donc, les enseignements tirés des données nous orientent sur les actions prioritaires à initier et à mettre en œuvre afin d'assurer l'accès à l'éducation pour tous les enfants au niveau du Burkina Faso. Toutefois, l'élimination des obstacles à l'éducation des filles en situation d'urgence appelle à plusieurs entités. Il y a l'accroissement des capacités d'accueil scolaire et le soutien en fourniture scolaire. Il y a également l'accès au logement et au vivre pour les familles déplacées internes. Les familles, quand elles se déplacent, elles fuient la crise, elles perdent tout et elles ne disposent pas du minimum vital sur les sites d'accueil. Il y a également la lutte contre certaines violences dont j'ai tantôt parlé, qui sont perpétuées à l'endroit des filles, notamment les mariages précoces ou forcés. Il y a l'excision, par exemple, le fait que la fille se retrouve à la maison et ces pratiques reviennent. Il y a le travail des enfants, les corvées ménagères. Approfondir la documentation des interventions les plus porteuses en matière de promotion de l'éducation des filles en situation d'urgence, cela aura l'avantage de renforcer les messages et rassurer les décideurs dans l'adoption des recommandations du plaidoyer. Donc, nous recommandons fortement aux autorités à prendre à bras le corps la question de l'éducation des filles, mais surtout l'utilisation des données pour les actions, pour les projets, les programmes et surtout pour les prises de mesures d'accompagnement pour répondre efficacement aux besoins réels des populations, mais surtout aux besoins réels des filles et des femmes, pour celles qui vivent dans les situations de crise ou dans les situations d'urgence. Nous avons interpellé à travers le plaidoyer national que nous avons réalisé au niveau du Burkina Faso que le gouvernement puisse rendre l'éducation imposable comme un droit et punissable par la loi, parce que cela permettra à la majorité des filles de reprendre le chemin de l'école et d'être protégées de certaines violences dont elles sont victimes quand elles restent chez elles à la maison. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Micheline. Wow. I took so many notes. I don't know if everybody who's here is taking notes as I am, but I was blown by the recommendations, the data that they shared, but a couple of things kept coming that offered me more thoughts, especially the community mobilization, the fact that we have to think about stakeholders that can make education a reality for girls in emergencies. We need to think on how diverse the stakeholders can be. It can be parents, it can be schools, it can be church, it can be community initiative where the girls took part of, and how can we involve all of those people into making sure that they understand how important the education of girls is. Then the policy advocacy part on how data is actually very important in making sure that once you have the data, now you have a way of creating a conversation and then a way of making your advocacy more effective and also more coordinated. Then there is Nadia that spoke about that gap between data collection from grassroots and national database and how much of capacity building most grassroots organizations need in terms of data sharing. We are going to go to the next conversation, but I would like all of us to keep thinking about things we are hearing. So when we go back to the report, after today, we really can take back all we heard today into our work and reflect more onto it. And then also the last thing that actually stayed with me is strengthen multi-sectoral responses, to be able, for example, to realize how the lack of education in emergencies is connected to other sectors of life. Because if we want to reduce teen pregnancies, then we have to address the issue that many girls are not in school. And then that exposes them to unwanted pregnancies, exposes them to child marriages and so on. Our next conversation is going to be a panel. And I have two amazing speakers, Jessica Odi and Maha Schwab. I hope I'm pronouncing your name well. And the conversation is on decolonization. We spoke about decolonizing funding system. We spoke about Canada being one of the countries that has a feminist foreign policy that sometimes is driven by decolonizing. But let's hear more from the experts on the ground. Jessica Odi has worked in the humanitarian education space for the past decade, globally, including protracted urban and camp refugee settings, internal displacement, resettlement, and transitory concepts. In 2020, Jess set up equity-based education and emergency consulting, supporting organizations, institutions, and academia to design and deliver equity-centered programs, policies, and research rooted in social justice, decolonial, and equity-based design thinking. Maha Shuab is the director of the Center for Lebanese Studies since 2012. She was a senior fellow at St. Anthony College, University of Oxford, and a visiting fellow at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge and the American University of Beirut. She was also a part-time lecturer at the Lebanese American University. Maha has a PhD in education from the University of Cambridge. She's also a founding member and the former president of the Lebanese Association for History. Before we get into the questions of today, I wanted to ask a question that I think everybody should be aware of. Jessica and Maha, could you tell us what is decolonization to you? And decolonization in the humanitarian space, in humanitarian settings, what is decolonization and how should that look like? I'll start with Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and to, having heard the fantastic presentations, I think we've got some really good indications of what a more equitable humanitarian system should and could look like. You asked the question what decolonization should look like in this sector or in education and emergencies, and I'm not 100% sure if it's possible, because decolonization to me is about a real it's about the redistribution of power, position and privilege, and a restructuring. And I think because, and the report, EM 2030's report really speaks to this, the system and EIE is coming from a place of colonialism, and colonial legacy. So whilst I don't know if decolonization is possible for the sector, I do think there's many things that we can do to make this a much more fairer and more equitable system. But I'd be interested to hear what Maha thinks about that.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Do we answer this and then give our presentation just so, hello, can you hear me? I'm not sure if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, great, excellent. Sorry, because I can't hear. Yeah, I think I agree with you, Jess. It's very much about unpacking powers, and it's also about unpacking political economy that governs how the resources are planned, as you've already rightly highlighted to. And it's also about a very important thing that is very relevant to our discussion here is how we push beyond theory, or how we link theory, practices, scholarship, and activism. And this is, I think, this was the point I was going to make in my presentation, is data can't just exist on its own. It has to be linked to bigger processes related to activism, related to theory, related to scholarship, related to this kind of discourse that we have between practitioners, policymakers, and academics. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I think
yes, it is. Yes, it is. I just wanted to make sure that everybody here can understand the definition that we are using of decolonization before we get into your presentation. So it's just plain and clear for everybody. So Maha, can we start with your presentation?
Sure. Okay. So following up on these, on the points that, what does, how, I think we've had very good testimonies and examples from the previous speakers talking about data and how it can be used and some of the limitations. In my presentation, I'm going to be talking from my experience as an academic and working in a research institute based in the global South and North. And I think one of the questions or the concerns that I have when we talk about data, particularly in education and emergency, and particularly from a practitioner perspective, is sometimes, or even policymakers like UN agencies, is the tendency sometimes to restrict the use of data and the purpose of data to just programming. And I think this is back to the question that you raised about decoloniality. It's important that we don't just collect data just for programming and just to highlight where the gaps are so we can do interventions. It's very important that we link it to, when we ask ourselves, what's the purpose of this? How is this linked to our understanding of what education and emergency should achieve? So it's of a concern to me if we collect data just to plan interventions. It's important that we also go back to the questions about education and emergency and the purpose of education and emergency. And generally, education in emergency, if we look at the literature, the purposes of it is very vaguely defined, and it's rarely contextualized within different contexts, particularly in context where maybe the educational system is very weak, maybe where refugees or the local population doesn't have an equal membership with the community, so they can't realize or reap the outcomes of education, such as employment or such as participation, political, civic, economic participation. So in these cases, often education ends up just becoming a literacy program, which is good, but it's not enough. This is not the main objective of education. It's far beyond that. And I think also it's another issue linked to this is when we think of data only for programming, we are depoliticizing and we're dealing with the whole context as an apolitical, as if there is no political context that we are working with that might affect women's participation or women's the kind of outcomes we would get from these educational programs. And this is of a concern. Data needs to challenge as well the political structure and the power dynamics that exist within the system. It's also about challenging the kind of policies that are being designed by aid organizations. So we should not take for granted that the system is okay, we know where we're heading, and all we need is just to fill in data gaps. This is, I guess, one very important message that I want to highlight. Another, so in addition to exploring and linking this data to bigger questions about the purpose of education and the system, another layer is who is going to gather this data, who's having access to it, who owns it, who's going to share it, who's going to disseminate it. We have a big issue of, particularly in aid organizations, that even when they gather data, they restrict access to it. So I personally have stopped doing many of these consultancies where I would collect data or do reports for many of these agencies because you can't use the data. As a researcher, this is knowledge that you have to share. It's an ethical responsibility for us to share this, but we find that many organizations restrict this. Even if they do their own evaluation or they collect their data, they wouldn't share it. So this is another important is who will own this data, who will use it, but also which questions it will answer. Will it answer questions related to the structure, to the power dynamics, to the accountability? We know that a lot of funding is going into education, but we see very limited data about transparency in the use of this funding. And this goes back, to the discussion about decoloniality. If the discussion is only restricted to knowledge gaps because I want to do a program for gender, I'm missing half of the issue here, because it's what are the structural barriers that are hindering the participation of women? How is the aid system hindering or not? How is it strengthening the structure or not? It's important that we also collect data that examines the power dynamics that exist in any context. Otherwise, we're just going to be scratching the surface and always being in a responsive mode. And this brings me to the different actors who can work in terms of data collection and what infrastructure exists for research and knowledge production. So you can collect data for tracking and monitoring and evaluation. That's one type of data. But another type of data that we want to collect is to generate knowledge and to generate a dialogue and a discussion about education. And it's very important that we link this this knowledge cycle to the public and to engage people in this discussion. If we want to really highlight and engage people in the important role of education, we need to share this more widely, that more actors are engaged in this discussion. And we need to also produce the kind of knowledge, because at the moment, what we see is most of the knowledge that we have, or the theory that we have, is often developed in the global north, where, you know, this is where the theory is made. And we are always perceived as just data collectors that just feed data to give a few examples of context. But we don't see institutions, enough resources put into local institutions in order to generate the kind of knowledge and to investigate the questions that are important to the local context. So one very important thing, I think, to challenge the power dynamics is to invest a lot in local research organizations, to build the research capacities and put resources into strengthening these research capacities. This is key if we are going to see local knowledge being produced, extrapolated, and feeding into the global discourse around issues of education emergency. Otherwise, we will always be consumers of theory that is produced in the global north, and we're just filling data gaps. And I guess this is the thrust of my discussion. We should go away from discussing and focusing on data gaps to what kind of knowledge we can produce in order to know more about our system, in order to know more about the kind of solutions that we want to invest. Just to conclude with, it's very important that we bring politics back into any discussion on data. Otherwise, we are overlooking the structure, we are overlooking the barriers that impede a local agenda for knowledge production and for data. We need to, data is also a very important source for accountability, and it has to be used also for this, and holding everyone's accountable. And it's important to strengthen local research capacities and push beyond this hegemony of knowledge production that is only in the global north. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maha. Jessica.
Yeah, so I think I had similar thoughts reading the report on the ways that power dynamics in education and emergencies impact the data response and policy making. I mean, reading the report, even though the report explored the EIE landscape in Kenya and Burkina Faso, two countries with very distinct humanitarian issues, the findings indicate systemic issues, and that as a sector, education in emergencies needs to a radically different approach to data, to coordination, to program design and policy making if gender equity in education is to advance in 2022. As noted in the report, the legacy of colonialism and other historical injustices are central to the conditions of poverty, destabilization, and violent conflict that are barriers to girls' education in emergencies. And for me, this was very refreshing to read, because macro and structural analysis and inherent kind of asymmetric power dynamics are rarely acknowledged or centered in education and emergencies discourse. And so expanding on the findings from the report, my takeaway is that EIE data response and policy making can reinforce power dynamics and global inequities in several ways. So firstly, so local, national, and people with lived experience, people who've been recipients of education and emergencies interventions, are rarely in positions of power or influence. And we know that since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, there has been a renewed kind of impetus across the sector to challenge the status quo of an aid and development system that is dominated by northern actors, at the exclusion of those closest to the affected communities, or indeed the communities themselves. But despite these commitments and discourse, which has only increased in the wake of COVID-19 and the ripple effect of the Black Lives Matter movement and this kind of reawakening around global inequities, community-based organizations such as the women's rights organizations that we've heard about today, and which are the findings from the report, are still currently absent from national, and I would also add global level discussions on the shape of education emergencies. At present, the overwhelming majority of key EIE institutions, whether it's donors, networks, academic institutions, have not created processes, governance, or coordination structures that would enable girls and women rights organizations, particularly those with lived experience of EIE, a seat at the table. And therefore, we have a context or a sector where the people with the greatest proximity to the issues, people with lived experiences, are often furthest from decision making and inclusion in these kind of global steering committees and institutions. And so I think going forward in this year, we really need to consider how these asymmetric power dynamics are invoked and reinforced through coordination and policy mechanisms. And as Maha said, like more inclusive practices would also contribute to much needed accountability to girls, well, for everyone in crisis context. And this kind of asymmetric power dynamic relates to my second takeaway from the report, which speaks to whose knowledge matters and is considered valid. And that's something that has arisen from the other panelists as well. We know that EIE data has a critical role to play in designing programs and developing trainings and understanding of learning in challenging contexts. But we also have to recognize that the current approaches to data collection are not always fit for purpose. Firstly, communities have very little say in the framing of research priorities, the questions, the analysis, the dissemination, and the advocacy agendas that come out of them. As Maha also mentioned, like Northern actors tend to operate a monopoly of knowledge production and determine the types of knowledge. This is valued by others. We know within our sector, EIE data is often quite quantitatively driven as well, and maybe focuses predominantly on Western notions of what education is and learning metrics. And the consequence of this is evident in the data insights within the report, where the type of data that is collected, even when it is accessible to community groups, groups say that it's not often of great use. And it is also noted that the data is rarely desegregated sufficiently, resulting in EIE data response and advocacy that can really homogenize the experiences of children, teachers, and people affected by crisis. And as my fellow panelist, Micheline noted, intersectionality is an essential lens for anyone working in EIE, because we know that girls and female teachers are not a monolith and exist in social, cultural, political contexts where, factors such as ethnicity, class, caste, age, gender, disability, sexuality, etc., affected individuals' educational and teaching experiences. And so if education is to be the great equalizer, we need programs and policies that consider the breadth of people's distinct needs and assets. And for me, intersectionality also means going beyond collecting disaggregated data to, again, really reflect on the power dynamics within EIE data and evidence ecosystem. So just as we know that affected communities are rarely involved in the data analysis and the prioritization and determining agendas, we also know that the products, they're also not involved in the products that come out of this. So the guidance, the gender responsive pedagogies and toolkits that are designed from the data are predominantly designed by people who have very little understanding of the context, the culture, even the language. They are packaged as universal or agency owned products and approaches. And so much nuance and rich locally rooted expertise is missed as a result of this. Other panelists have also spoken to the kind of nature of data and research. And there is this growing critique of the extractive nature. By this, I'm referring to the methods that are used. And again, dissemination, often there's no feedback to the communities. It's not necessarily translated into local languages, and people are not remunerated for being the subjects of data and evidence collection, even though the output could be the organizations, institutions, and individuals who conduct the data collection are often remunerated in numerous ways. I thought it was very interesting that the data from the report also highlighted and noted concern by EIE stakeholders on the capacities of women's rights organizations and community-based organizations to engage in data sharing and ensure the reliability of the data collected. Because arguably what we know of the current status quo, INGOs, government bodies and universities have severe capacity deficits themselves in implementing kind of equitable, culturally responsive data and evidence practices. And so I think, one of the things that really came through and that we need to act on is this notion that women's rights organizations are because of where they are situated, are likely better positioned to design and collect nuanced, culturally informed data that would provide critical insights currently absent from girls' education. And my final point, or final takeaway then from the report, is around the invisibilization of community groups in responding and advocating for girls' education in emergencies. I think COVID-19 has been a critical wake-up call for us to reconsider and acknowledge the roles that parents, teachers, and the community play in education. However, at present, if you go to the websites of any leading education and emergency stakeholder, the majority do not highlight the work of local partners who may be the ones implementing the programs, therefore invisibilizing the people who are really at the front line. The findings also indicate that global institutions impose funding structures for women's rights organizations and community-based organizations. And without sustainable and fair funding, we know that grassroots organizations can burn out and fold. And I think, as other panelists have mentioned, if we really want to have equitable EIE ecosystems, there's a real case there to see more participatory grant-making practices in the sector. And just thinking about the invisibilization of groups, the report shares some insights around the state of teachers and that refugee teachers who are paid incentives earn less than 1/10 of a national teacher's salary in Kenya. The stark pay inequities there are not unique to this context, but indicate kind of broader structural inequalities in aid. And it reminded me of something that my colleague, Xu Rubin, noted at a recent conference that I was involved in, the SEED conference, that the current system enables an international EIE expert to earn more in one day than a refugee teacher makes in a year. So if we want to have a gender justice orientated EIE sector, that must go hand in hand with a critical reflection of some of the current exploitative and at times dangerous labour practices that undoubtedly contribute to teacher attrition. And again, the report also talks about there is copious amounts of data that are currently available that indicates the barriers that girls and female teachers face, but targeted actions are not being applied. So yeah, I'm going to stop there, but those were some of the key insights that I took away from the report.
Thank you so much, Jess. Continuing on this conversation, I wanted to have all of us reflect on humanitarian with the development nexus. What are the linkage and barriers with the existing data systems and collection in emergencies? I'm happy with whoever wants to start between Jessica and Maha.
That's a very good question, and I think it's a bit difficult in some senses. I'm more familiar of the context in Lebanon, for instance, where there have been attempts to bridge the humanitarian development, and I feel, despite the attempts to bridge that, you do see that at least in the case of Lebanon and in even the case of Jordan, that refugees continue to be in a parallel system, and so you do see like humanitarian funding being invested in the education system of the host country, but this is not cascading down to refugees. And I think this is why when we see when we witnessed COVID, the first thing that we notice is refugees kind of like were thrown out of the system, and the host country was just occupied with providing education for the national students. So this is why I still feel that this kind of like there's still a big division, and this is why we don't see that the data is always handled with a transparency. I personally feel that even some of the figures that sometimes we see, the few ones that exist, how transparent they are. From our research, we are very skeptical, and this, I think, this marriage between humanitarian agencies and the educational system of the host country is a little bit worrying, because there's a need to show that the money has been invested and the number of students enrolled are high, and sometimes there isn't enough accountability and the transparency and reliability in this data. So this is why I think, this is why we need more independent research and more independent data to understand exactly what kind of issues that are, is this data reliable, first of all, and how much data there is, because we also see very limited data, and the whole world froze, and we see very little attention being given to the impact of COVID and the pandemic on refugees, and how it affected, how much learning they've lost, and how will they catch up on this. There's very limited discussion so far, and great silence around what will we do with all of the learning that they've missed on, and how they will continue their education.
Jess?
Yeah, maybe so I agree with the proposals that Maha put forward, and maybe just to add to the second part of the question, which is considering the kind of linkages and barriers with existing data systems and collection in EIE. I think there's several opportunities for linkages to existing data systems. For example, that in most crisis contexts, there's an education working group or an education cluster. However, these national and global coordination mechanisms must do more to ensure that these spaces are driven and inclusive of people who have lived experience of displacement, of teachers, and who are involved in the EIE ecosystem as teachers, learners, and community stakeholders. In 2021, and from the example we heard earlier from the panelists in Canada, we have seen agencies and networks starting to open up and recognize the inequities in the system, and I think we need to double those efforts in 2022. I also think that as EIE stakeholders in positions of privilege, we need to, I'm speaking as myself here, but we need to start advocating for systems change and recognize that gender responsive EIE that does not pay attention to these differences in power dynamics and the material conditions and intersectional needs will not be able to work towards keeping girls or female teachers in schools.
Thank you so much. I want to pick on what Ma spoke about, data accountability and how much data is sometimes restricted or kept confidential and not available to the communities that actually needs it. How do you think we can address that? How can accountability look alike when it comes to data sharing, from institutions that actually have the power and the resources, even the capacity to get all this information, all this data, but make sure we hold them accountable to make it available to other institutions, other organizations that don't have the resources, even the capacity to access it?
Thank you for this. I think it's a very important question. I don't think there's enough discussion on accountability. And I think this is where we have to play a big role. And I think we, as different type of organizations, we really need to put a bigger pressure. While it might be a bit difficult sometimes on our to put this pressure on our governments, because we know that there is a pandemic corruption as well. I think it's very important that we push UN agencies, either UNICEF or UNESCO, who are partners with these host organizations, push pressure that they have to give us the data. They need to make it transparent. They need to make their evaluation and monitoring reports available, more widely available, and the different research that they produce also available. We as researchers should not be asked to give up our right to share the findings from these studies that we do to these agencies because of confidentiality. I think this, if we talk about research ethics, unfortunately, often research ethics are, they protect institutions sometimes more than they protect the populations that really they aim to serve. So this is where I think we need to push, right? Hold more events, and advocacy and lobbying efforts around accountability and transparency of data.
Jess?
Yeah, so I think on the same thread as we talk about the need for more disaggregated, more intersectional, more ethical approaches to data. I think particularly in conflict-affected crisis, it's important to recognize that there may be resistance and hesitancy to data collection, especially when it's top-down in nature. And we have to remember that, you know, there is collective memories of imperialism and research and knowledge production history as a colonial commodity. So I guess this is another reason why the report and the findings really stress the need for localized and locally owned approaches to data collection. And I think just in light of this and in light of what we've heard today, you know, a new kind of social contract is needed for EIE, which is driven by affected populations, which is driven by women's rights organizations and community-based organizations that really embrace this intersectionality and broader definitions of educational expertise. And that really responds and mitigates the reproduction of exclusion through its structures, systems, and knowledge productions, which negatively impact and make it very unaccountable in certain contexts.
Thank you so much. Jess, you spoke about intersectionality a couple of times, especially when we started, and you spoke about girls not being a monolith, that their experiences are shaped by the cultural realities, you know, and other diverse effects that are seen in their lives. I want us to speak about more, I want to hear more about it from you, because one of the things that you spoke about is locally driven, you know, ways of collecting data. Could you give us an example of how that should look like? You know, we have people here from different institutions that may be interested in knowing how to shift the ways they were operating to locally driven, you know, data system and collection, but mainly how should they adopt intersectionality into the ways they've been dealing with data, especially data sharing and data collection?
Sure, and I think we heard from Micheline today, a really brilliant example of an organization that is using an intersectional approach, so taking into account the diversity and recognizing diversity and difference and how that interacts with educational access. So we know that organizations are already doing this work, and I think we need to be looking to those organizations who have that expertise to be informing us. For me, something that I'm very interested in is participatory action research, because I think it pushes back on top-down institutional kind of driven research approaches. It puts it's something that is very much centered on co-design, so designing with as opposed to designing for affected populations. So really amplifying and recognizing the expertise that girls and women's rights organizations and community members have in these contexts, and designing with them the research that they want to do, and using methods that they want to use, and analyzing it through approaches and understandings that they use. I think that's a really good way of addressing some of the concerns that have come up through and have been noted through this report, and as the people have spoken about on the panel.
Maha, still with us?
Hello, sorry, I lost you. Sorry, I've lost you. I've lost you for a bit. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we are talking about intersectionality. You know, it has been one of the topics that have come in throughout this conversation. So I'm more interested in, could you give us an example, your thoughts on how we can adopt intersectionality when doing data sharing, data collection? How can organization adopt it? And how should intersectionality even look like for locally driven data sharing and data collection?
I think it's been touched quite a bit in the report and in the people in different presentations. I think issues around gender, disability, age, urban, rural, socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicity. I think all of these issues And unfortunately, often we tend to tick some boxes but forget others. And this is why it's very important that we have this question and when we include on our data, because often we have groups that we don't examine. Now, as Jess said, there is the challenge of practically on the ground how much you can gather data, particularly for groups that we very hard to reach, or and how people perceive data collection. As I said, it has colonial heritage. There is issue of what do you do with data, how much they can trust the groups and the confidentiality of this data. So there's a lot of sensitivity around this issue, but this is where I think the importance of investing in local research organizations. I also want to touch on one thing we didn't discuss a lot is I've seen many NGOs trying to strengthen their research arm. And they find it very difficult to do this because the resources are limited, the sizes of these organizations are limited, and the expertise. And this is why, as Nadia said, the partnerships between the different stakeholders is very important, between higher education, between research, women organizations and other NGOs, because the more we have this local organization that people can trust, the more it's easier to reach to these groups that are difficult to reach. And this is why I emphasize, really we need to invest a lot in strengthening the research capacities locally.
Yeah, that's actually why I'm happy that I'm part of a conversation that involved local organization and also trusting that they are capable of producing the data and the information of things that are affecting their lives. I want to bring in the rest of the panelists we had today. If you want to contribute to this conversation, we spoke about decolonization, intersectionality, pushing for local driven data sharing and data collection. Before we move on, if you want to add something, Teresa, Nadia, feel free.
I think I'd like to add, I guess, briefly from our experience, right, in this partnership is that, I think the conversation on decolonization and intersectionality always comes up in our work, right, in the development sector. But sometimes you need to ask yourself, are you really living it in the work that you do? And I think Equal Measures is trying as much as possible to adopt that approach even within the partnerships. Oftentimes you find that these partnerships and these collaborations around data sharing and learning and developing capacity exist, but they tend to be very top down, right, from the people who are bringing the expertise, and they also tend to be quite extractive because, again, you are coming to people and requiring a lot from them to extract data from them to use. And so I think there needs to be much more also thought that's put into co-creating these data capacity collaborations that exist, so that they are coming from a place that is already shifting and sharing power around knowledge, and also the kinds of needs and knowledge that different actors, especially women's rights organizations, need. And back to this question of how do you really decolonize the space? We keep saying this, and I think this point is becoming quite redundant, but it's also about the funding, because where does the money go to? Who does the money go to? What kind of accountability? Who are you accountable eventually? Are you going to be accountable to the donor that's funding your project, or in this case to the girls? Because we tend to lose sight of the fact that all these investments that are going into data, into capacity development, into collaborations in EIE are to improve education outcomes for girls and women in these contexts. And the last point that I want to make relates to this humanitarian development nexus. There's quite a tension, right? Because on the one hand, you have this action that is immediate, that's urgent. People need to go to school, they need classrooms, etc. And then you have the tension with the quote unquote medium to long-term response, that's the development response. But actually you cannot see those things as two separate things, and which is why we're pushing for this thing of you need to collaborate, you need to talk more and to engage more with people who are based within these communities and who bring the real local knowledge to be able to make the decisions, even the short-term decisions make sense. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Micheline, I see that your hand is risen. Can you unmute yourself?
Oui, désolé. Merci beaucoup. Et il y a tellement de choses à dire et le débat est tellement intéressant également. Nadia vient de le soulever, où va l'argent? La difficulté que nous avons, c'est le fait de ne pas avoir ces données désagrégées intersectionnelles qui font ressortir certains besoins ou certains obstacles dans l'éducation des filles qui ne sont pas prises en compte par les autorités. Quand les ressources sont disponibles en fonction des priorités, des choix, les ressources ne vont pas toujours à l'endroit où il faut les mettre pour que ça puisse améliorer l'éducation des filles. Donc, c'est un grand défi. Et quand on prend la question de l'intersectionnalité dans notre contexte du Burkina, où, par exemple, les jeunes filles handicapées n'ont pas accès à l'école, ce sont des personnes vraiment qui sont laissées en marge d'éducation parce que les infrastructures scolaires ne sont pas adaptées à l'accès et il y a des organismes qui présentent souvent des reportages sur des cas concrets de jeunes filles qui ne peuvent pas venir à l'école, soit parce que l'enfant n'a pas de fauteuil roulant. IPBF en a fait dans cette année de fauteuil roulant à des jeunes filles pour qu'elles puissent se déplacer. Il y a aussi l'espace en classe ou les modules même d'enseignement pour les enfants autistes. Je sais qu'au Burkina, il y a peu d'écoles qui sont inclusives qui prennent en compte ces enfants. Donc, il y a ce besoin-là de transversalité, d'intersectionnalité, afin de pouvoir prendre en compte ces besoins qui sont réels. Et beaucoup de filles en souffrent et qui n'ont pas accès à l'école. Il y a la question des ressources, il y a également les personnes marginalisées, que ce soit les personnes vivant avec un handicap, où nous avons beaucoup de jeunes filles qui ne sont pas allées à l'école et comment on arrive à les faire retourner ou trouver une forme d'éducation qui permettent qu'elles puissent vraiment apprendre quelque chose. Donc, voilà un peu ce que je voulais partager rapidement. Je vois qu'il reste peu de temps. Merci beaucoup. C'est très intéressant et beaucoup de choses à dire. Merci.
Okay, thank you. I want to add something based on what the other panelists have said. One thing that we also need to put into consideration is people living with disability, especially the vulnerable girls who are living with disability. We realize that most of the time they are left out when it comes to data collection. And so this means that also their issues are not really put on the table when it comes to discussions on how are we really supposed to address the issues that they are facing. So as women's rights organization and even the local community, we really need to ensure that as we are collecting data, let's put people with disability or even girls with a disability at the center of this all, so that we can not really just focus on girls in general or refugee girls, but also the ones who are even more vulnerable, who cannot move, who cannot hear, and who even experience challenges that are even more advanced. Another issue that we need to consider is we have had instances, for example, where we write proposals, but you realize that once a proposal has gone through and there is an issue that has come up within the community, stakeholders tend to say that that was not included in the proposal. Does it mean that then the issues that we are addressing is donor-driven or community-driven? So there's really need for us to look at what are some of the key issues within the community. What are those issues that the community considers a priority? So that let's not aim at addressing our own issues based on the proposal that has been modified in a way that suits a specific issue, but let's always look at collecting data and ensuring that we integrate the real issues that are affecting our community members so that they tend to own now the process of even addressing that issue. That will really go a long way in addressing barriers to girls' education in refugee areas and even conflict-affected areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone who contributed. I think one thing that I'm going to emphasize that Nadia spoke about is, are you really living it when it comes to decolonization? But one thing about decolonization is not a one-time event. It's continuous work, you know? And I'm happy that a few years ago, this conversation could not happen where decolonization will be a recurring word, you know? But 2022, it's coming together. We are talking about it. Shift the power is coming. So it means that we are on the right path. And as Mariama Kaba has taught us in feminist practice, hope is a discipline. So you have to always practice having hope. So I'm very hopeful that decolonization is possible if we build up on this continuous conversation, but also keeping asking ourselves, people part of these institutions and community organization and all this donors-driven initiative, are we really living it? Next, time is of the essence. I wish we could stay on, but trying to keep the time. I'm going to allow Alison Holder, Director of EcoMeasure, to give us a wrap up and recommendations, so we can have takeaways from this report, but mainly make key recommendations that we all should keep at heart from this report.
Thank you so much, Judy Kael. So my name is Alison Holder, and I'm the Director of Equal Measures 2030. Hopefully you've learned with us here today, we are a collaboration of national, regional, and global leaders from feminist networks, civil society, international development, and the private sector. And we believe that data can expose inequality and injustice, motivate change, and drive accountability. It's really been an honor to co-host this event and to hear this incredible group of stakeholders working on women and girls' rights in emergency contexts, sharing their experiences, their expectations, and their demands to ensure that listening to women's rights organizations is a key ingredient for everyone wishing to achieve the Charlevoix and SDG 4 commitments. I think what we've heard here today and what I've seen with the privilege of kind of seeing this project unfold at a distance, but really women's rights organizations are absent in national conversations about education in emergencies, national and international. And I think from the partners that we've met through this project and through the voices we've heard today, we know that women's rights organizations can bring nuance, can shine a light on the most marginalized girls and women in particular, and crucially, the language around shifting the power, I think, is an incredibly important message to take away. It's obviously we've had data as kind of a cross-cutting theme today. And I think for us as Equal Measures, we see in all of our programs, projects, partnerships, and collaborations that when women's rights organizations have access to and are really using data in their advocacy, that they're more confident, that they're influential, that policymakers stand up and listen. And one of the, when I've talked to partners, EPBF and FAWE through this project, one of the questions I like to ask is, were the policymakers you met surprised by any of the data they shared? And usually the answer is yes, even when often that data comes from the government's own data, but it's when it's in the hands of women's rights organizations who can really bring the context of the women and girls that they work with in the community every day and align that with the data to show the importance of these issues, to show the barriers for women and girls. And so I think it's an incredibly powerful approach, and I'm just really grateful for the chance we've had to learn with partners on this project. What really struck me here was also there's urgency and impatience underpinning everyone's comments. I love the idea that we wouldn't have had this conversation 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, but still there's so much more to do. And I hope everyone will check out the report, which we can put in the link to in the chat here in case anybody hasn't had a chance to see that. But Nadia and the partners have really done a great job of showcasing how more responsive, tailored, and effective solutions, how these solutions need to be informed by the knowledge. We've talked a lot about knowledge, who owns it, who has the power to gather it, whose knowledge is trusted. And I think the report really touches on that to give us a really different perspective on the barriers and challenges girls face in accessing their right to education. We know from all of our work as Equal Measures that feminist and women's rights organizations and movements have their fingers on the pulse. They understand barriers to girls' education. They understand the ongoing challenges for a diverse constituency of girls and women, and the experience and evidence held by women's rights organizations is a valuable bellwether, and it's got to be a critical input to all accountability processes, including for the SDGs, for programs like the Charlevoix commitments, and many others. So here's our takeaways. We need to invest in women's rights organizations and feminist movements. We need to value their data, their knowledge, their evidence and expertise, and we need to listen to and act on their demands. On behalf of all of our co-hosts, the Government of Canada, FAWE, EPBF, UNESCO, and the Geneva Global Hub for EIE, we just thank you so much to the speakers and to the participants for their time and your openness to share, and for the commitment of all of the partners on this project, which has been delivered on very, very short timeframes with ambitious vision and also through a pandemic. So just really grateful for the collaboration and the privilege of learning from you.
Thank you so much, Alison. we are going to our closing remarks. Our last speaker is Petra Husser from the Geneva Global Hub for EIE, who will provide our closing remarks. She has worked for the past 13 years in international humanitarian field for the protection of children, refugees, and migrants. Prior to joining Geneva Global Hub, Petra held the role of Deputy Coordinator at the UNICEF-led Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility, where she also worked to advance initiative for increased collaboration between education and child protection in emergencies, and deployed to over 10 emergency contexts.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and hi everyone. As we come to the end of this meeting, I'd really like to thank each of the hosts and partners who have contributed to this very thought-provoking session. To Equal Measures 2030, of course, FAWE, IBBF, UNESCO, Plan International, Global Affairs Canada, Equity-Based EIE Consulting, and the Lebanese American University. I extend my appreciation on behalf of the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies. I'd also like to thank the representatives of the permanent missions of Burkina Faso, Canada, Kenya, and Switzerland to the UN in Geneva, both for joining us today and for their ongoing support to the strengthening of girls' education in emergencies. The Geneva Global Hub for EIE is proud to have been part of this important discussion, especially since one of our key purposes is to bring actors together across sectors, disciplines, and across the humanitarian development divide. Considering that imperative, we found today's discussion very important. As such, there are a few thoughts and questions we wish to leave with and carry forward into our further engagements. We all together need to look more deeply into the gendered impact of a lack of quality education in emergencies. We need to think about what challenges in emergencies exist for girls of different ages, such as violence, child marriage, lack of access to health care, and menstrual hygiene products, leaving them at increased risk of missing out on education, just as we need to think about how missing out on education compounds gendered risks and disadvantages. Equally, we need to think about how these relate to other issues and what other actors we need to draw into this discussion about education and emergencies and gender. Today, we heard about the diverse and valuable work that women's rights organizations are contributing in this field. What is more, the health community, the peace community, climate, inclusion. Our discussion today links with all of these topics and actors. As has been highlighted here today, we must all continue to push our partners working in these other sectors to understand the importance of integrating considerations of gender and education into all plans, preparation, and responses to emergencies. This goes for decision makers and those involved in implementation. And importantly, as we have heard today, the connection, the close connection between the two. We need to reflect on our capacities to link the important work being done by grassroots women's organizations into the decision-making processes at national and international levels. There is a need for sensitization and capacity building, which many of us in this gathering here today can take the lead in address. And without a doubt, the availability and accessibility of quality data or knowledge, as mentioned today, will be a cornerstone for our efforts to effectively make this case. For us here in Geneva, being part of a two-way exchange of relevant data, having the ability to respond to needs and locally led demands is essential to successfully drive change in our forums. We will continue to exchange with Equal Measures 2030 and its partners to support this message and encourage others to do the same. So thank you everyone for joining us, for your interest in the new report, its content, and for your contributions to this discussion. And please keep an eye out for follow-up information on the session. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Petra. Wow, it's been 2 hours. We can still go 1 more hour if you all are with it, because I'm happy to. It's been so much learnings for me, but also so much that we need to keep talking about. I will give you a little bit of a roundabout of what we talked about today. So one of the things that I took note of that I really want to keep thinking about is how much I'm a feminist that actually believes that solutions to issues that African women and girls face are literally the same. And throughout this conversation, when we started, we learned that even though contexts are different, threats remains the same, that the realities of women and girls living in emergencies in Kenya are similar to the same realities of women and girls in Burkina Faso living in emergencies, that the same threats remain the same, that actually they are connected with these threats more than we think, and that solution can actually intersect. Then we also got to learn on how women's rights organizations throughout this 2-hour conversation, that women's rights organizations play a very critical role in collecting, analyzing, and using data. But also I was really happy to hear on how Eco-Measure is driving a conversation on how data rooted in community, data rooted in grassroots community can actually drive change. We also got to talk about data accountability and a conversation on how can we actually create more accountable data sharing and data collection. Then the famous phrase that I'll be using every day, are you really living it? When we speak about decolonization, beyond the words shift the power, beyond the words decolonizing, are we really living it? And then lastly, I took note on how we need to integrate intersectional data and resources and ask ourselves, who is going to benefit from this data? Who has access to it? And then who should have access that doesn't have access, and how can we facilitate that this information is accessible to everybody? So the policy report is available for everybody on ECO's Measure website. So feel free to read it, to share it with everyone. They also have a quiz on girls and education on their website that has additional information and references on anyone who wants to delve deeper into the topic. They have recording from the previous event that took place at analyzing country context for Kenya and Burkina Faso. And then they have different links in the chat that you could access. I would like to thank every single person that is on this webinar. We were about 100 people. I'm really, really excited that this report is going to be accessible to everyone. So please, let's read it, let's share it. Let's make sure that we take advantage that we have data accessible to us. And thank you to FAWE Kenya, to IBPF, to Plan Canada, to the Global Hub of Geneva. Thank you everybody that was on this call. I think we can end the webinar now. Or should we stay 1 more hour? I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy Kyle, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you.